Carlos Castaneda's A Separate Reality, Part 2, The Task of Seeing, Chapter 10. I went back to visit Don Juan on March 30th, 1969, and bluntly told him that I wanted to take another crack at seeing. He shook his head negatively and laughed, and I felt compelled to protest. He told me I had to be patient and that the time was not right, but I doggedly insisted I was ready. He did not seem annoyed with my nagging request. He tried, nevertheless, to change the subject. I did not let go and asked him to advise me what to do in order to overcome my impatience. "You must act like a warrior," he said. "How?" "One learns to act like a warrior by acting, not by talking. You said that a warrior thinks about his death. I do that all the time. Obviously, that isn't enough." He seemed to have an outburst of impatience and made a smacking sound with his lips. I told him that I had not meant to make him angry, and if he did not need me there at his house, I was ready to go back to Los Angeles. Don Juan patted me gently on the back and said he never got angry with me. He had simply assumed I knew what it meant to be a warrior. "What can I do to live like a warrior?" I asked. He took off his hat and scratched his temples. He looked at me fixedly and smiled. "You like everything spelled out, don't you? My mind works that way. It doesn't have to. I don't know how to change. That is why I ask you to tell me exactly what to do to live like a warrior. If I knew that, I could find a way to adapt myself to it." He must have thought my statements were humorous. He patted me on the back as he laughed. I had the feeling he was going to ask me to leave at any minute, so I quickly sat down on my straw mat facing him and began asking him more questions. I wanted to know why I had to wait. He explained that if I were to try to see in a helter-skelter manner before I had healed the wounds I received battling the Guardian, chances were I would encounter the Guardian again, even though I was not looking for it. Don Juan assured me that no man in that position would be capable of surviving an encounter. "You must completely forget the Guardian before you can embark on the quest of seeing," he said. "How can anyone forget the Guardian? A warrior has to use his will and his patience to forget. In fact, a warrior has only his will and his patience, and with them he builds everything he wants." "But I am not a warrior." "You have started learning the ways of sorcerers. You have no more time for retreats or regrets. You only have time to live like a warrior and work for patience and will, whether you like it or not. How does a warrior work for them?" Don Juan thought for a long time before answering. "I think there is no way of talking about it," he finally said, "especially about will. Will is something very special. It happens mysteriously. There is no real way of telling how one uses it, except that the results of using the will are astounding. Perhaps the first thing one should do is to know that one can develop the will. A warrior knows that and proceeds to wait for it. Your mistake is not to know that you are waiting for your will." My benefactor told me that a warrior knows that he is waiting, and he knows what he is waiting for. In your case, you know that you are waiting. You've been here with me for years, but you don't know what you are waiting for. It is very difficult, if not impossible, for the average man to know what he is waiting for. A warrior, however, has no problem. He knows what he is waiting for his will. "What exactly is the will? Is it determination, like the determination of your grandson, Lucio, to have a motorcycle?" "No," Don Juan said softly and giggled. "That's not will. Lucio only indulges. Will is something else, something very clear and powerful, which can direct your acts." Will is something a man uses. For instance, to win a battle which he, by all calculations, should lose. Then, will must be what you call courage, I said. No, courage is something else. Men of courage are dependable, noble men, perennially surrounded by people who flock around them and admire them. Yet very few men of courage have will. Usually they are fearless men who are given to performing daring common sense acts. Most of the time, a courageous man is also fearsome and feared. Will, on the other hand, has to do with astonishing feats that defy our common sense. Is will the control we have over ourselves, I asked. You may say that it is a kind of control. Do you think I can exercise my will, for instance, by denying myself certain things? Such as asking questions, he interjected. He said it with such a mischievous tone that I had to stop writing to look at him, and we both laughed. No, he said, denying yourself is an indulgence, and I don't recommend anything of the kind. That is the reason why I let you ask all the questions you want. If I told you to stop asking questions, you might warp your will trying to do that. The indulgence of denying is by far the worst. It forces us to believe we are doing great things, when in effect we are only fixed within ourselves. To stop asking questions is not the will I am talking about. Will is a power, and since it is a power, it has to be controlled and tuned, and that takes time. I know that, and I am patient with you. When I was your age, I was as impulsive as you, yet I have changed. Our will operates in spite of our indulgence. For example, your will is already opening your gap little by little. What gap are you talking about? There is a gap in us, like a soft spot on the head of a child, which closes with age. This gap opens this gap opens as one develops one's will. Where is that gap? At the place of our luminous fibers, he said, pointing to the abdominal area. What is it like? What is it for? It's an opening. It allows a space for the will to shoot out like an arrow. Is this will an object or like an object? No, I just said that to make you understand. What a sorcerer calls will is a power within ourselves. It is not a thought or an object or a wish. To stop asking questions is not will because it needs thinking and wishing. Will is what can make you succeed when your thoughts tell you that you are defeated. Will is what makes you invulnerable. Will is what sends a sorcerer through a wall, through space, to the moon, if he wants. There was nothing else I wanted to ask. I was tired and somewhat tense. I was afraid Don Juan was going to ask me to leave, and that annoyed me. Let's go to the hills, he said abruptly, and stood up. On the way, he started talking about will again, and laughed at my dismay over not being able to take notes. He described will as a force, which was the true link between men and the world. He was very careful to establish that the world was whatever we perceive, in any manner we may choose to perceive. Don Juan maintained that perceiving the world entails a process of apprehending whatever presents itself to us. This particular perceiving is done with our senses and with our will. I asked him if will was a sixth sense. He said it was rather a relation between ourselves and the perceived world. I suggested that we halt so I could take notes. He laughed and kept on walking. He did not make me leave that night. The next day, after eating breakfast, he himself brought up the subject of will. What you yourself call will is character and strong disposition, he said. What a sorcerer calls will is a force that comes from within and attaches itself to the world out there. It comes through the belly, right here, where the luminous fibers are. He rubbed his navel to point out the area. I said that it comes out through here because one can feel it coming out. Why do you call it will? I don't call it anything. My benefactor called it will. The other men of knowledge call it will. Yesterday you said that one can perceive the world with the senses as well as with the will. How is that possible? An average man can grab the things of the world only with his mind, or with his eyes, or his ears, but a sorcerer can grab them also with his nose, or his tongue, or his will, especially with his will. I cannot really describe how it is done, but you yourself, for instance, cannot describe how you hear. It happens that I am also capable of hearing, so we can talk about what we hear, but not about how we hear. A sorcerer uses his will to perceive the world. That perceiving, however, is not like hearing. When we look at the world or when we hear it, we have the impression that it is out there and that it is real. When we perceive the world with our will, we know that it is not as out there or as real as we think. Is will the same as seeing? No, will is a force, a power. Seeing is not a force, but rather a way of getting through things. A sorcerer may have a very strong will and he may not see, which means that only a man of knowledge can perceive the world with his senses and with his will, and also with his seeing. I told him that I was more confused than ever about how to use my will to forget the guardian. That statement and my mood of perplexity seemed to delight him. I've told you that when you talk, you only get confused, he said and laughed. But at least now you know you are waiting for your will. You still don't know what it is or how it could happen to you. So watch carefully everything you do. The very thing that could help you develop your will is amidst all the things you do. Don Juan was gone all morning. He returned in the early afternoon with a bundle of dry plants. He signaled me with his head to help him, and we worked in complete silence for hours, sorting the plants. When we finished, we sat down to rest, and he smiled at me benevolently. I said to him that in a very serious manner that I had been reading my notes, and I still could not understand what being a warrior entailed or what the idea of will meant. Will is not an idea, he said. This was the first time he had spoken to me in the whole day. After a long pause, he continued, "We are different, you and I. Our characters are not alike. Your nature is more violent than mine. When I was your age, I was not violent, but mean. You are the opposite. My benefactor was like that. He would have been perfectly suited to be your teacher. He was a great sorcerer, but he could not see. Not the way that I see, or the way that Gennaro sees. I understand the world and live guided by my seeing. My benefactor, on the other hand, had to live as a warrior. If a man sees, he doesn't have to live like a warrior, or like anything else, for he can see things as they really are and direct his life accordingly. But considering your character, I would say that you may never learn to see, in which case you will have to live your entire life like a warrior." My benefactor said that when a man embarks on the paths of sorcery, he becomes aware, in a gradual manner, that ordinary life has been forever left behind, that knowledge is indeed a frightening affair, that the means of the ordinary world are no longer a buffer for him, and that he must adopt a new way of life, if he is going to survive. The first thing he ought to do at that point is to want to become a warrior, a very important step and decision. The frightening nature of knowledge leaves one no alternative but to become a warrior. By the time knowledge becomes a frightening affair, the man also realizes that death is the irreplaceable partner that sits next to him on the mat. Every bit of knowledge that becomes power has death as its central force. Death lends the ultimate touch, and whatever is touched by death indeed becomes power. A man who follows the paths of sorcery is confronted by the imminent annihilation every turn of the way, and unavoidably he becomes keenly aware of his death. Without the awareness of his death, he would be only an ordinary man, involved in ordinary acts. He would lack the necessary potency, the necessary concentration that transforms one ordinary time on earth into magical power. Thus, to be a warrior, a man has to be, first of all, and rightfully so, keenly aware of his own death. But to be concerned with death would force any one of us to focus on the self, and that would be debilitating. So the next thing one needs to be a warrior is detachment. The idea of imminent death, instead of becoming an obsession, becomes an indifference. Don Juan stopped talking and looked at me. He seemed to be waiting for a comment. "Do you understand?" he asked. I understood what he had said, but I personally could not see how anyone could arrive at a sense of detachment. I said that from the point of view of my own apprenticeship, I had already experienced the moment when knowledge became such a frightening affair. I could also truthfully say that I no longer found support in the ordinary premises of my daily life, and I wanted, or perhaps even more than wanted, I needed to live like a warrior. Now you must detach yourself, he said. From what? Detach yourself from everything. That's impossible. I don't want to be a hermit. To be a hermit is an indulgence. I never meant that. A hermit is not detached, for he willfully abandons himself to being a hermit. Only the idea of death makes a man sufficiently detached, so he is incapable of abandoning himself to anything. Only the idea of death makes a man sufficiently detached, so he can deny himself anything. A man of that sort, however, does not crave, for he has acquired a silent lust for life and for all things of life. He knows his death is stalking him, and he won't give him time to cling to anything, so he tries, without craving, all of everything. A detached man who knows he has no possibility of fencing off his death has only one thing to back himself with: the power of his decisions. He has to be, so to speak, the master of his choices. He must fully understand that his choices, He must fully understand that his choice is his responsibility, and once he makes it there, is no longer time for regrets or recriminations. His decisions are final, simply because his death does not permit him time to cling to anything. And thus, with an awareness of his death, and with his detachment, and with the power of his decisions, a warrior sets his life in a strategical manner. The knowledge of his death guides him and makes him detached and silently lusty. The power of his final decisions makes him able to choose without regrets, and what he chooses is always strategically the best, so he performs everything he has to with gusto and lusty efficiency. When a man behaves in such a manner, one may rightfully say that he is a warrior and has acquired patience. Don Juan asked me if I had anything to say, and I remarked that the task he had described would take a lifetime. He said I protested too much in front of him, and that he knew I behaved, or at least tried to behave, in terms of a warrior in my day-to-day life. "You have pretty good claws," he said, laughing. "Show them to me from time to time. It's good practice." I made a gesture of claws and growled, and he laughed. Then he cleared his throat and went on talking. When a warrior has acquired patience, he is on his way to will. He knows how to wait. His death sits with him on his mat. They are friends. His death advises him in mysterious ways about how to choose and how to live strategically. And the warrior waits. I would say that the warrior learns without any hurry because he knows he is waiting for his will. And one day he succeeds in performing something ordinarily quite impossible to accomplish. He may not even notice his extraordinary deed. But as he keeps on performing impossible acts, or as impossible things keep on happening to him, he becomes aware that a sort of power is emerging, a power that comes out of his body as he progresses on the path of knowledge. At first it is like an itching in the belly or a warm spot that cannot be soothed. Then it becomes a pain, a great discomfort. Sometimes the pain and discomfort are so great that the warrior has convulsions for months. And the more severe the convulsions, the better for him. A fine power is always heralded by great pain. When the convulsions cease, the warrior notices he has strange feelings about things. He notices that he can actually touch anything he wants with a feeling that comes out of his body from a spot right below or right above his navel. That feeling is the will, and when he is capable of grabbing with it, he can rightfully say that the warrior is a sorcerer and that he has acquired will. Don Juan stopped talking and seemed to await my comments or questions. I had nothing to say. I was deeply concerned with the idea that a sorcerer had to experience pain and convulsions, but I felt embarrassed about asking him if I also had to go through that. Finally, after a long silence, I asked him, and he giggled as if he had been anticipating my question. He said that pain was not absolutely necessary. He, for example, had never had it, and will had just happened to him. One day I was in the mountains, he said, and I stumbled upon a puma, a female one. She was big and hungry, and I ran and she ran after me. I climbed the rock and she stood a few feet away, ready to jump. I threw rocks at her. She growled and began to charge me. It was then that my will fully came out, and I stopped her with it before she jumped on me. I caressed her with my will. I actually rubbed her teeth with it. She looked at me with sleepy eyes and lay down, and I ran like a son of a bitch before she got over it. Don Juan made a very comical gesture to portray a man running for dear life, holding on to his hat. I told him that I hated to think I had only female mountain lions or convulsions to look forward to if I wanted will. My benefactor was a sorcerer of great powers, he went on. He was a warrior through and through. His will was indeed his most magnificent accomplishment. But a man can go still farther than that. A man can learn to see. Upon learning to see, he no longer needs to live like a warrior, nor be a sorcerer. Upon learning to see, a man becomes everything by becoming nothing. He, so to speak, vanishes, and yet he's there. I would say that this is the time when a man can be or can get anything he desires, but he desires nothing. And instead of playing with his fellow men like they were his toys. He meets them in the midst of their folly. The only difference between them is that a man who sees controls his folly, while his fellow men can't. A man who sees has no longer an active interest in his fellow men. Seeing has already detached him from absolutely everything he knew before. The sole idea of being detached from everything I know gives me the chills, I said. You must be joking. The thing which should give you the chills is not having anything to look forward to, but a lifetime of doing that which you have always done. Think of a man who plants corn year after year until he's too old and too tired to get up. So he lies around like an old dog, his thoughts and feelings, the best of him, rambling aimlessly to the only thing he has ever done, to plant corn. For me, that is the most frightening waste there is. We are men and our lot is to learn and to be hurled into inconceivable new worlds. Are there any other new worlds for us, really? I asked, half in jest. We have exhausted nothing, you fool, he said, and imperatively. Seeing is for impeccable men. Temper your spirit now. Become a warrior and learn to see. And then you'll know that there is no end to the new worlds for our vision. End of chapter.